It's like everyone tells a story about themselves inside their own head, always, all the time. That story makes you what you are. We build ourselves out of that story. Patrick Rothfuss.
Bending Not Breaking, Season 7, Episode 8, Remembrances. And welcome back to another episode of Bending Not Breaking. I'm Sunshine. And we are into what is this? Is this the least favorite Korra episode out there?
I don't know. I like there were elements that I enjoyed, but I'm not interested in watching. This is only helpful, I think, for me as an episode to watch when I've done a full series watch.
Yeah, because they do these things like they do these episodes a lot of times before streaming, right? Before the streaming aspect came out to where people could rewatch and rewatch and rewatch. Because even now, even new shows are typically on a streaming platform after they arrive. And so the ability to kind of like watch those episodes or go back, so we don't see a lot of rehashy episodes because even Grey's early on, I think, did like these big shows would do these things where it's just kind of like, oh, remember that time when so and so was here, and then they'd flash back to a montage. And so we don't get a lot of those anymore in new shows because, again, the access, and I think I'm not going to say the seriousness of storytelling because it's always been serious, right? It's always been this genre, but almost the credibility of television has grown so much that people pay attention and focus and dial in, and so you don't necessarily need these like little rehashy episodes, which this really feels like a kind of a series wrap.
And I think that's what it is, more so than it is like a rehash, right? It's more of a in the same way that Avatar: The Last Airbender had the Ember Island players. This is a kind of a way for us to remember how far we've come. And it's at the end of this is 4 years after the show has been on air. And that's like, I think communicating, again, this isn't something people normally will just binge all the way through. It's something that people 4 years to consume. And they may not have watched seasons 1, 2, and 3 recently, right? And so it completely changes the game.
I will say Ember Island's players, I think, is one of the most ingenious ways of doing a recap. That is lightning in a bottle that is tough to just directly copy. But the idea of we're going to put a stage play on, like it would have been funny if Varric made a mover with like actors and things like that of that. But again, you don't want to redo the same thing.
Exactly.
And you still want it to fit within the realm of the stories. And so the way they go about telling these stories, I think, does really work well, sitting and rewatching them. And then I think it was a smart to kind of bring in these like little commentary moments, but we'll dive in a little bit more to that. But
agreed.
Before we do that, the lens we're doing is storytelling.
Wow. I love stories.
Which, of course, you look up the definition, and that's like the thing of telling a story. Like telling a story is storytelling. And you're like, cool, thanks, guy.
Thanks, buddy.
thanks, white man definition. The social and cultural activity of sharing stories, sometimes with improvisation, theatrics, or embellishment. Every culture has its own stories or narratives, which are shared as a means of entertainment, education, cultural preservation, or instilling moral values. And that I really like that encompassing definition a whole lot more than kind of like Oxford Dictionary.
Yeah. No, I that's great.
Because I think that highlights a little bit like this can be something for education or for moral values or for cultural preservation. Like those things feel like they have weight and so much more importance than when you just think of like, I'm telling a story, right? And so, because I don't know how often we think of things like shows. When we think of this show, we've been doing this podcast for 7 seasons now of like, instilling moral values or education. And so, those things, it's interesting to think of the pop culture we consume to kind of fit within those parameters of, oh no, this story really, because when you look into some things, especially like uh, horror movies, I think the genre of horror films really, you can kind of pinpoint where in time they were morally and ethically and societally, like by watching those movies through those time periods, because you can typically be like, oh, they're punishing people for that. That is what they felt um, at the time was, this the moral standard. And it's interesting to see kind of the time capsule that exists when you watch movies from the last decades.
Yeah. No, I think one of the things that's captured in story is, let's think about like the connotative definition of story versus the uh the definition I want to kind of live into. And what I think when people like think of story, it's almost like whimsy, or like
Yeah.
even stories are like, oh, you're just telling a story. Sometimes like stories are another way, it's another way of saying it's fiction or a lie, right? Oh, it's just a story. It's not, doesn't carry weight. And I think the opposite is true. I think that there are so many great quotes from authors and people, like the 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 purpose of storytelling isn't necessarily to tell a person how the storyteller thinks, but rather like to give the person listening to the story questions to think upon. And that's what, when the way we approach Avatar, the way we approach Korra, it gives us questions to consider. And I think how we approach a story really kind of is a better indicator of whether it's whimsical or whether it's not. So for instance, if, I think jokes are stories. I think often humor is rooted in story. And so we've talked about when somebody tells a joke that is problematic and they're telling a story, if we approach it as, oh, it's just a joke, oh, it's just blah, 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 then the weight it carries will be different. But we have to recognize that people are going to hear that story and approach it differently. And some people are going to give that story more weight than the author intended. And so it goes into intention versus impact here too, right? And so I think there storytelling is a medium of communication, and we can't control how people will receive a story, right? Even as we can control how we deliver a story. And I think that's something to consider.
Well, stories shift the cultural norms, right? Like when we hear
Absolutely.
stories, the stories we tell ourselves over and over again shift our mentality and shift the things that we consider to be normal or true. And that's why people argue that representation is super important, right? When we see things on screen or in books and we feel connection and we become connected to those things and cultures, like we learn more, right? We experience those things. That's why people say read books by authors that don't look and feel like you get connected and rooted into these stories that are, allow you to kind of expand your worldview.
Yeah.
But also that happens vice versa, right? If we're telling stories that are problematic over and over and over again, we start assuming that that's the norm,
Mhm.
and we start accepting that that's an acceptable way of storytelling. And so it's the way we storytell as a culture deeply moves us into
Yes.
one direction or the other. Um, but it's also like everything can be a story, right? Like data points is a story, but
Yeah.
then the way we embellish that story or the way we give meat to those bones when we tell the story that those data points reflect allows people to connect with it, allows people to understand it. It is very unlikely that your best teachers out there will literally just read a PowerPoint of like, this is a data point, this is a data point, this is a data point next. The teachers that really connect with students are the ones that are, this is a data point, this is a data point, and here's what it typically looks like when you put it into context with the world that you're in. And so that allows people to
Yeah.
connect and thrive off of that. Storytelling is deeply important. And some of your best speakers, some of your best teachers, some of your best leaders are really good storytellers because they allow people to
Yeah.
connect with what they're doing.
And I think what often those storytellers do is frankly, there are archetypes of story. And there are stories that, like, if you look at the basic bones of most stories, they fall into one of seven. And these are the seven archetypes that I kind of want to pull out. And so one is overcoming the monster. Uh, the next is rags to riches, the quest, voyage and return, comedy, tragedy, and rebirth. So those are these 7 archetypes. And, I think that anytime we are hearing a story, often we can lace these data points and say, oh, the way you're constructing this story is you're saying that when we do these things, we can overcome the monster of X, Y, or Z. Or when we do these things, we're showing how, especially if we're looking at data points around like, the finances from the country from where it began, like the Revolutionary War all the way to now, we might say that it's like a rags to riches when
Still rags.
Yeah. So depending on who's telling the story and how it's crafted, you can use data points to construct your story, even though the data points might indicate a different story altogether when told in a different way. Which I think leads to Hannah McGregor, who wrote, A Sentimental Education. And this book, basically her thesis is that reading a book alone does not instill a certain type of value. It is how we engage with that book. And so it is the same thing with these stories. When the common narrative and common talking points around a story are rooted in whiteness or white supremacy, then what people get from that text will be those things, right? Which is why I think, speaking to your point, when we start to include more authors and more books and more storytelling from people outside of that lens, it leads to a different set of questions and a different set of talking points, which then changes what we take from the book. But again, like Avatar in and of itself does not instill good values. It is how you treat it and the questions you ask about it that lead, because there's a lot of curmudgeons that we don't like in the fandom that watch this show don't have great values, right? There are a lot of misogynistic people who watch Korra, right? And watching Korra doesn't mean that they're going to like lose their misogyny. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And so I think that is kind of a case in point of like just watching the show doesn't instill values. However, when you're asking it questions, when you're living with it and you're looking at the data points in community, oftentimes it will shift how you view certain things, which is exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's jump in. I've got a 30-second recap to do about the recap episode.
So great about that. I love it.
Oh, you're going to love it.
Yeah. Are you ready?
Oh, yeah, I'm ready.
On your mark, get set, go.
Mako tells Prince Wu about his past, and then Korra and Asami talk about their past. And then Varric tells a story about Bolin's past.
Come on. Oh my God, are you going to stop? You're done? You have 10 seconds. Okay. All right.
The credits then start to roll.
Okay, here we go. I mean, might as well keep going. Like, okay, we're almost there. 30 seconds. Okay.
And then the screen goes blank.
See,
because the episode is over.
You missed it. You went outside your time. You had all that time. Still missed it.
Failed.
Yeah, we're familiar with everything that happens in this.
Yeah, I mean, part of my recap was going to be like, you can go listen to our other 30-second recaps.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing that's different is the commentary, right? There's
a few differences, right? Which we'll get into, like maybe the way Varric tells Bolin's past is not super factual, but the commentary is a nice piece of it, which is actually one of the first points I wanted to bring up about the stories we tell ourselves, because that was the big theme, is the stories we tell ourselves, the ones that are in our head, the ones we tell, right? And there's sometimes we know, Varric, that we are going off the story the way the truth happened, but we're trying to tell a good story.
Yeah.
Right. And sometimes we do that for good and for bad, right? There's times where I think about Remember the Titans. There's the time where Coach Boone gives us really empowered, like, when I was a kid, I had 12 brothers and sisters, and I had to take care of every one of them to like get his quarterback amped up. And the coach kind of goes, "You had 12 brothers and sisters?" He goes, "7." He's like, "All right, 12 sounds better. That's right. All right, cool." Right? Like, so there's moments where we like will change maybe the story for a purpose, and that purpose
Yeah.
can be good and for bad, right? That's
Embellishment, right?
yeah. So we get that, but we also, one of the things that I want to talk about is the commentary throughout this episode. One of the nice things about it is the feedback we get from the people we care about when we are sharing our feelings and the stories that we have that we tell ourselves. There is
Yeah.
something incredibly strong, incredibly powerful about people being able to challenge the stories that you're telling about yourself, um, and giving feedback in those moments, right? I love when Prince Wu's like, "That was a good breakup. That sounds like that's the way that a breakup sounds like." Because it was, you knew that you broke up and everyone was aware, where the first one didn't really sound like a breakup to me, right? So
Yeah.
these are moments where that's very real when Frank can kind of say, like, "That was not good. You did that poorly. That was not clear." Um, and I like that. I like those moments and those abilities to say, no, tell people the stories that you're feeling about yourself and allow people to kind of poke holes or lift up and validate, right? Those are all things that can be super positive.
And I think it's interesting that you brought up Varric's point here to kind of talk about that, because I can see that with all three of these main stories that we get, or these three main perspectives that we get. Because Varric is, he's creating a story, and the purpose of his story is very different than what Mako's telling of his story is. And
Yes.
very different than Korra's sharing her version of events. Each of those contexts are very different. And Varric is creating this story, frankly, for what sounds like, I'm going to make this mover and we're going to make a ton of money off of it.
Yeah, it's entertainment purposes.
Entertainment,
Purely.
very different
Yep.
than me recapping truth about my past and why I am the way I am. Varric and Bolin is kind of grappling with that with Varric, is saying that's not how things went. Um, and it kind of goes to this. One of the last quotes of the show is Baraz, who is the guy that looks like Avatar Wan on this boat with Varric, says, "It's just a mover. Don't overthink it. It's like a ride." And I think, like, there's a part of me that very much agrees with that, of like, you know what, that like, it's okay to consume media that is not meant to educate you. It is okay to consume media for fun. And the other part of me is like, no, Bolin, like, this is Bolin's trying to, like, what he's trying to accomplish through this is like, ooh, does this feel ethical? Like, this just feels like we're like lying to a bunch of people. And I think it comes down to what we're trying to get at. What is the purpose of why you're consuming the media? And what is the purpose around why you're watching, or creating and watching?
There's a lot of questions that come up with that too, because the first thing that comes to mind for me when it comes to Varric and Bolin is Varric is not telling his story; he's telling Bolin's story, and so
Yeah.
Bolin should be able to consent with what is being told and how it's being told. Um, Consuming media that is just fun, 100%, until that fun is harming somebody, right? And you also need to be able to process those things. And you can do things for fun while also having a critical eye, right? I watch dumb reality television shows all the time, where the point is for it to be dumb and stupid and me watching. And sometimes there are problematic things that happen on and off of those shows with like the contestants that are there. And it is also important for me to understand and hold truths to that as well, right? So like sometimes it has to be a little bit of both. Um, but for Varric and Bolin, yeah, Varric's trying to make something that's going to make money and it's going to be entertaining. And there are times where Bolin's like, "Ooh, that sounds like a good part," even though it's not exactly how things played out. Um, but I mean,
I was going to say, there's also a question for me of whether Varric actually wants to turn this into a mover, versus whether he's trying to tell this story because he's bored on this boat as they pass the time. Right?
which
And
can also be true.
and part of me thinks that, there's an implication that they've all been sharing stories, and Varric's like, no, I haven't been listening. I've been creating my own story. Let me tell you all about it. And I think there's an element of that too, of, having Bolin be kind of the butt of a joke, in this story is his joke in a way, but this intention of being entertaining without, again, Bolin's consent, because they have a relationship in which I can take advantage of you a little bit and still be in your good graces, right? And it makes me feel like a little,
A little
ooh,
icky.
little icky. And I'm also like, I chuckled, right? I found the villain bit hilarious. I had forgotten about the villain bit, right? Where they like,
Always makes me laugh.
it's so funny. Like it's ridiculous to have all four of them in a room, Batu on a phone, right? It's like it's so outrageous that of course it couldn't be true. And it's so irreverent that like it's funny.
Well, one of the
And
cool parts is this is the creators telling the story as well, right?
exactly,
And so
yes.
them being able to poke fun at things that are that they know maybe the audience didn't love at the time
Uh-huh.
in real time and kind of make fun of themselves by like poking fun at Unalak, right? Like that's hilarious in the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, and it's just it's interesting how that dynamic landed, right? And so I think that that is like, again, it comes across as icky to me. I'm curious how other people received it, but I imagine that a lot of people, when watching this, didn't feel icky about this retelling. Imagine a lot of people watched this story and were like, "Yeah, that's just really funny," and I don't have any qualms.
Well,
Um,
and that's that go we'll go two things because that's going to pivot to another point. Um One, I think it depends on who you relate to in that, right? Like there's a lot of times where I see myself as the storyteller of Varric. Love
yep.
telling stories, love crafting things like that. And so there's I'm like, Varric's fine. Varric didn't really do anything out of hand. All those things kind of did happen.
Yeah.
If you relate to Bolin in this moment,
Mhm.
there's a good chance where you're like, no, I've been the person in the room where someone's telling a story about that I didn't consent to, and it sucked.
Yep.
It didn't feel good. It hurt. And so I
Yeah.
think, which leads me to my next point, which is we can experience the exact same moment. And the focus of importance of that moment, that the main focal point we take away from it, and what happened and how we perceived what happened can be very different things, right? So we see multiple instances of Korra meeting Mako and Bolin in the locker room.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of differences in the way it's perceived, except maybe like Bolin kind of romanticizes it a little bit more than maybe
Mhm.
what actually happened. But you can see the moment that they thought was important was different in each of those circumstances, right?
It's different. Yeah.
Um, because typically it's which one involved me the most is what I'm remembering and taking
Yeah.
away as the important moment. And so it's we can all experience the same thing, but the story we take out of that can be very different depending on who you are, which isn't a surprising revelation, but it is an important one. That is a
Well,
very common thing when we are in conjunction with other people.
and I think if we get meta a little bit and go back to like the way that the whole episode as a story is being conveyed to us, we often throughout Avatar and Korra get a omnipresent view of a scene, right? Where we have there's usually a focal point that the writers are gearing us towards, but we are also seeing other people in this thing. And so we have an outside perspective of watching a scene where we aren't necessarily in someone's head, right? And this is why I really loved this focus. I think there's a very intentional choice of having Mako be the one who is narrating the first half of this episode. And I think it's because so many people have a problem with Mako. And there he caught so much flack for good reason, right? Because our perspective, what we saw of him, really made us question all of the things that were going down. But this really gives us a lot of compassion for Mako because we're hearing it from his perspective, right? And like throughout these series, when these events are colored by what he's going through and the thought process he has, it's like, oh, it makes perfect sense that he acted this way. It makes a lot of sense that he was confused in this moment, right? And when we hear that from his perspective versus what we presume we predominantly watch through Korra's perspective, it completely shifts everything. And I think that's probably one of the reasons they chose Mako to be the voice of the first half of this episode.
Which I think that highlights exactly how we walk into spaces, right? You and I engage in a moment and take very different relations. You did this because you were being mean, or you wanted to hurt me, or you were just trying to be, intentionally obtuse. I did this because I wasn't in a mental space to actually communicate well because I was exhausted from X, Y, and Z. And so the last thing I needed to do was people this time. Someone else who's watching from the outside seeing that interaction is like, do these people hate each other, or do they like each other? Or like, and so like everyone's taking something different. And so the ability to then, when we have those types of conflicts or those moments in life with the people that we care about, hey, this happened today. Didn't feel great to me. What were you thinking? What was going on? Can we talk about it a little bit? Because I want to understand this moment, and that, I mean, those things happen all the time. There's so many times where me and my partner might just say something like offhandedly because we're tired or snippy. And then like 30 seconds later, just be like, hey, that was a snippy response because I was upset about this one thing. And I took it out on you in a really short moment. And so, like, I'm sorry. Yeah. But like, those are things that, like, when we don't re-engage into that conflict and share what the stories we were feeling in those moments, the stories that we then start to tell ourselves about that moment expand and we build up. And this isn't the first time that this has happened. And I'm going to build an arsenal of the story that I'm going to link over the last year of all of these little moments. And we start to really harm what's going on. And so again, the ability for us as the audience to see this is where Korra was at in the moment, because that's kind of who we watched it through at the time. We see the overarching. Now we get to hear Mako. Oh my, it's natural for us to be like, oh, we're kind of more empathetic with Mako now.
Exactly.
Which is what happens when we listen to other people's sides of stories.
Yeah. Part of me thinks that partnership is writing a joint story together versus having two individual stories. Mm-hmm. Right. And so the story I'm telling myself about what happened is not the same as someone I am in community with. But when those two stories are conflicting, that leads to friction, right? But if we tell our stories together and say, hey, this is the version that I just like, that I'm interpreting, is that correct? It gives opportunity for the other person to be like, no, that's not how I interpreted that at all. And then what they can do is collectively write this. But what that requires is, one, a whole lot of self-awareness, right? You have to recognize that you're telling yourself a story. That is hard, right? And the second piece is being able to voice it, because there's a lot of vulnerability in that too, because the consequences of the stories we tell matter as well. And so if the story I'm telling is that you don't like me when I do X, Y, or Z, then I'm going to feel really nervous about voicing that story aloud, because what if you not liking me leads to me losing something? When our privileges, when our needs are on the line in the sharing of stories, it becomes really, really complex. But I think, again, communally, we have a responsibility to tell a story and recognize that our story can never be complete because it is coming from our perspective alone, right? And I think that's what we see with Korra and Asami. There's this really beautiful moment where Korra is saying, nobody needs me. Like I'm useless to the world. Toph told me that like the world doesn't need me. And Asami's like, excuse me, the world needs you. You're the avatar. And these are two like opposites on an extreme spectrum, right? Where you are needed, you're the avatar. If you aren't here, the world will fall, versus you're not necessary. The world will continue regardless of whether you're here or not. And we want there to be some like, how do we navigate both of those two things, and that both of those things are true? And that's a really complex story, right? And Korra is really grappling with the fact that there are two narratives, and that's hard. That's hard to deal with.
It is tough. One of my favorite moments of this episode is the Korra Asami pulling together, because oh my God, do we need people in our lives to say, stop only thinking about the bad things that you are doing? You are
Yeah,
not a compilation of all the mistakes that you've made. Here is all the positive you've done. Just a super cool moment from Asami. And I'll already tell you, she's going to be my gratitude for this episode because, like, the ability to sit there and there's two different things, right? So there's always the moment of silver lining things, which is, I don't think that's what Asami's doing in this moment, right?
yeah,
There's the ability to silver lining things like, well, at least it's a sunny day outside, or well, you're going through this pain, but at least you're doing good in your job, right?
yeah,
Versus, like, I hear you, but I want to challenge that story and say, like, no, when this happened, this was the positive impact that came from it. And I think that is different than like trying to put a little like sprinkle on top of a crap sandwich when people are showing that, right? So, the ability for Sami to come in and say, like, nope, this was the good you did, I think is incredibly important.
yeah, yeah. I'm remembering a quote, and I can't believe I've forgotten the exact wording of the quote because this is a quote I used to say a lot, but it's on our refrigerator. the the idea of ourselves, it as we have all of these separate stories of ourselves, and the idea is that we aren't whole until we integrate those things, right? That what we have right now is we're seeing Korra grappling with multiple stories, and part of what I think her journey is the integration of living with those fact that all of those stories are true and that they are conflicting. And what integration looks like, what wholeness looks like, is when you can, when they can meet and they can mesh together and still be true despite them being conflicting. And that's just, it's really hard, but that, I mean, who we are is all of the stories that have existed in our past, and recognizing that even though we want to edit out some of those failures, that they are a part of who we are,
Mm-hmm.
which
Yeah.
is
The integration of the two, you don't have to ignore the good things to fix the things that you feel like you've done wrong.
yeah,
Um, and you can't only think of the things that you've done well in life and ignore all the mistakes you've made either, right? So,
well, and that reminds me of Tenzin coming in this moment too, because
mhm.
Korra's like on this one end of like, I'm a failure, I'm not useful, and then Asami's like, nope, we're going to bring you to the other side of this, and then Tenzin's like, let's take this from a perspective of how far you've come. And like, what a dude, right? Like, they're like, this is one of those moments where he comes in and is like, ding, ding, ding. Like, he doesn't always do that, but like,
But
this is
he's doing it a lot recently, yeah.
like his version of this story is that you came from a really tough spot and you look at how far you've come. Look at what you've accomplished, even with all the things that you have failed in, right? And it really reminds me of this view of what I hope um like parents do with their children and mentors do with their proteges, and that I saw you when you were not good at this, when you were actively like struggling. And I've seen you struggle this whole time, but through that struggle, you have gotten so far. And there's just this, you can sense the pride that Tenzin has for Korra in this moment. And it's just really a beautiful version of this story that I think that when we're down in the dumps, we are very susceptible to not seeing. We don't celebrate the fact that we have come so far. We don't celebrate our successes. We revel in our failures. And what we're learning from this scene is that it takes community again to really take in a story of ourselves that is integrating all of us and all of what we have done, rather than how sometimes when we do it by ourselves, we lose some of those really important aspects. So I guess it's just reminding me again of awareness, community,
Unity, yep.
like all the things that we kind of harp on, but maybe that's just our bias coming in.
Maybe. This is likely going to be a shorter episode again because it is a recap episode that we are recapping and discussing. But is there any other major points in storytelling? Because we've already hit on all of mine, but I want to make sure that you've hit on all the ones you want to lift up.
Yeah, I have one. This is, the Wu and Two dynamic during Mako's thing is really fun. But one of the things they said at near the end of Mako's story, I thought was really insightful and I think important to kind of discuss, which was, I think it was Two who said this, which is his cousin, who essentially says, you were so worried about disappointing one person that you ended up disappointing everyone. And I think that that's a really interesting reflection for Mako, right? In particular, because, and for all of us, when we try to avoid disappointing one person, that can often lead to us making decisions that upset more than that person. And I think that was so evident in Mako's story, that he was avoidant, and that avoidance led to disappointing more people than if he'd just been willing to have that tough conversation. And so I don't know how I'm relating that to storytelling, I guess, but I am noting that that seemed really important in terms of a reflection on Mako's story in particular.
What I almost drifted while you were talking about this thing because I'm thinking about all the times in my life where that has been almost very true, right? Like hyper aware of how I'm going to engage with one person and what else I'm putting on the line because of it.
Yeah.
And so the power in those moments, again, when we are allowing people to provide that feedback, how important that can really be, that ability to have whether it's one person or a small group of people, people you care about that are able to kind of say like, no, this is how I kind of see that. And
Yeah.
it doesn't mean you have to take every bit of advice that people give you. But again, when you're collecting multiple experiences and multiple viewpoints, you're typically going to have a solution somewhere in that fits the world that you want to kind of move forward in.
Yeah.
But you can't find that solution if you are not engaging in those moments of feedback.
Yeah. And I think that this is often what happens in sessions of therapy where people don't know how to notice that they're telling a story, or don't know how to be critical of their own story. And often, if they don't have that access to, speak their truth and to confront that story, that is what the process of therapy does, is it teaches you how to access your personal story, notice it, realize that you have control over the pen, and giving you a chance to write your own story versus letting it happen in front of you and being reactive to what happens in your life. Um, like, does that make sense? Does
Oh
that?
yeah, and I think what you probably just kind of hit on is because we know several people that have not enjoyed therapeutic sessions or have gone to therapists they didn't connect with, and I think one of the things that you're hitting on when it comes to the people that are providing us feedback on the stories we tell ourselves is, are they then just telling us their story as opposed to writing it together? Right.
Yes.
So, like, is a
Yeah.
therapist hearing you out and going, actually, this is what you're doing, and this is what's happening. And so, this is the solution
Yeah.
versus what we talked about earlier of creating that conjoined story to move forward together and find
Yes.
solution. And so, I think that you just kind of hit on one of the biggest problems with, uh, solution oriented or productive therapy versus the times we know that people have gone to therapy and have had to switch or change therapists because again they're not interested in writing the story together, they're interested in just telling their story, and then
And if
again that's a story I'm telling myself.
right, and if
So
we extrapolate to our friends, right, it's when our friends like jump straight to advice, and we're not looking for advice, we're just looking to like, hey, I'm feeling X, Y, or Z right now, and then that friend is like, okay, here's what's wrong with your situation, you got to do this, this, and this. That is the same, right? When your friends like are coming in and giving you unsolicited advice, trying to control the dynamic, again, it goes back to Brene Brown's like idea of empathic misses. And like if there was one thing I could teach people, like it would I think I would go with the idea of empathic misses because it gives me so much to talk about. Um, like that's just there's so much there.
It's one of the best questions I think for that section, and it's one that's becoming more known and almost becoming a joke. I feel like the more I hear it, is the
Mm,
concept of, are we in the problem solving stage or are we in the feeling stage?
yeah, it's becoming
Um,
a
it's
meme at this
becoming a
point.
joke. It's real. That's
It
such a like
is.
it's not like that's such a real question that is one that I in my partnership still is beneficial as long as they know that I'm not doing it in a patronizing way. So it has to be from a place of a genuine nature. Because if I come in and be like, "Are we in our feeling stages? Or are we in problem solving?" Because I'm ready to be in problem solving. You're wallowing in this little
Yeah,
garbage.
yeah,
But if you're really saying like, "Hey, do you want to vent about it?" Or are you at a place where you are asking for my advice on it? Because I can be both.
yeah.
And sometimes it's I just want to vent about it. And then I want to sit with it for 30 minutes and then we'll talk about what you would do differently. And then
Yep,
even in those moments, I have to recognize that like I can give 4 advice pieces and they can take none of it
yep.
or all of it. And that doesn't mean good or bad, right? Because that's the other side of
Yeah,
things. Um, when people give advice, the idea of like, no, I don't want to do that. No, I don't want to do that. No, I don't want to do that. Okay, well, cool. Like,
yeah.
cool. And then, but again, so I think that like, where are we? What is the purpose of these stories? What is the purpose of what we're communicating? What are we consenting to when we are telling the stories that we're telling? There's a lot of nuance and complexity when it comes to storytelling. And then
Yep.
there's no right answers. It all just kind of depends on each individual situation, every little snowflake, if you will.
Yeah. Oh, that just reminds me of, again, I've had several sessions now doing this tabletop role playing, and it's group storytelling is what it is. And if someone says something, this is how it goes, people can push back, but like improv begs of us this yes and mentality. And I wonder, like that requires a level of vulnerability of I'm willing to give up the story I'm trying to tell in order to accommodate the story we are trying to tell.
I think role playing games are a wonderful example of boundary setting that needs to happen, right? If you've ever played role playing, you have probably been in a situation where there's the one person who every time we're about to engage in a part in the story immediately jumps to combat,
Yeah.
right? Like that is the like I'm here to fight. I don't want to have this conversation. I punch him. Roll for initiative, right? Like you're just kind of like,
No.
and that's not what we're consenting to as a storytelling. Like that's not what we want. Like we a lot of times you want to engage in the story, you want to learn the things you need to learn. I need the information so we can solve this puzzle as a team, and you keep trying to kill everyone we talk to, right? So like again, what are we consenting to with the story? What is the purpose of this story? Because you might have a team where the purpose is to fight as many people as possible,
Yeah.
and make it out, in which case the person who is leading that story or kind of facilitating it can then create that story for y'all. But again, but if that's not what the whole team's looking to do, then that's not really what's happening, right? That's us hijacking it for the story that we want to tell and not the communal one that wants to be told.
Mm. Oh, I think that brings us to a great stopping point. There's a lot going on that we like. Storytelling is what a great lens. So I'm glad we were able to have it with this episode. Because it's a lot of communal storytelling and learning from one another. And I'm grateful that we could tell our story together, you and me. This is great.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, we're going to have a short little musical interlude, and then we'll come on back with all of the cool things in our final couple of segments. And welcome back. We're so excited to get down to the nit and gritty with our final couple of segments, starting with Twee and La, push and pull, the balance of what we liked and what we did not like. So give it to me. What are the things?
Yeah, what I dislike is recap episodes. And again, it's because the nature of them over the last 10 years and what is necessary out of them is deeply shifted, right? And this show came out 10 years ago, right? This episode aired 9 years ago. Right. So, yeah, right. So, like, I just don't need them. In fact, one of my least favorite mechanisms in storytelling, especially in movies, is when they cut back to something that happened at the beginning of the movie to show you how dumb you were. When they're like, I feel like it's like an Ocean's 11 thing, right? Except Ocean's 11 had a point to it, but when in movies they do it, like, remember that letter that he wrote? Remember how he signed it by this name? You missed it, you dumb. Like, I hate that is my least favorite mechanism in movies, and it happens all the time. And I'm like, ugh, I'm not stupid. You don't have to recap for me. Like, I did see it the first time, or like I can go back and rewatch it later, and then it will make more sense for me. It's more fun that way. I hate those. So, anyways, recap episodes. But I do like the commentary. It's like watching Mystery Science Theater. I thought that was a little fun. And so that does pull me in. What about you?
Well, it's just interesting. Like, I think you're kind of giving this, I don't think we need to spend and linger on it too hard, but your perspective is really interesting on a recap episode and assuming the intent of the person who goes into a flashback and why they chose to do it. And you like the story you're telling about why they did it is that because they think you're dumb. And the reason they might be doing it is because of who knows, right? And so it's just I just am reflecting that back, and this is the point of this is what we didn't like. And I agree, I don't also like the episode, but I'm also wondering about, like, that's probably not their actual intent, right?
I doubt it is for this. There are a lot of times I do think in movies where they say, what is the who am I making this for, right? And I want the general public to be able to watch this, which is great. And I think a lot of times things that, like, they pull out the nuance that exists in themes and kind of like hit you on the head with it, as opposed to letting you kind of like discover it and dive into it through conversations. And sometimes that feels a little annoying to me.
Yeah. I guess it's just a presumption of ability, right? Like, who is able to do this. Yeah. Okay. I digress. For me, I we talked a little bit about it, but I was like, Varric's like commandeering of Bolin's story was something that made me feel a certain way.
Yeah, it's icky.
And it's icky because I laughed, right? It's one of those things where, again, it's funny and like it feels odd. It just, we do it all the time. Like, Korra was created for capital gain. Like, this show that we're watching was created so that the people would make money, right? And it's to tell a story, but it just feels weird to tell, like, I'm going to create this story so I can make money off of it. And I guess and like, there's a lot of ethical things. I was like, I just didn't want to have that thought process. And like, that was me. So that's probably just me though. But next, things that were pulled in by, yeah, I agree, the commentary, but specifically, I really liked the Woo and Two combo. I thought that, like, their comedic timing and like assessment of Mako's situation was really apt. And so funny, the truth bomb, really a fan. So I enjoyed them.
Well, let's jump to our devotion.
Woo!
Through element of fire.
Fire.
And I think for me, the first thing that popped up with this is the idea of what is the purpose of the story we're telling, which brought to me the understanding of, like, what is the purpose of the fire that we're trying to make, or the heat that we're trying to provide, right? So, like,
if you went the same direction.
Did we?
Yeah.
Perfect. We both are devotions. But the idea around, I'm building a campfire, I'm going to build that fire a very specific way. I'm going to make that heat a very specific way because it's got a purpose, right? We're going to try to build it so the smoke's not coming around people's faces, but they can all sit around it and enjoy it. I am not going to cook. Sometimes it depends on what you're doing, but I'm probably not going to cook on a big bonfire, right? That's not going to be successful for me. I'm going to cook on a stove with concentrated heat that has a very distinct purpose on how it's made. I'm not going to heat my house with a bonfire. I'm
Yeah.
also not going to heat my house with the oven, right? Like there are like, and so how we the stories we tell and the purpose behind them and the point is important. It's going to determine what we're doing, and again, what if we're successful in doing what we're doing. If I'm
Yes.
telling a story for connection, that needs to be told a specific way. If I'm telling a story to disseminate information to 40 people, is going to be different than the story that I'm telling if I'm disseminating information to 2 people,
Yeah.
sometimes, versus 400 people in a classroom. The purpose is important to think about, and why we're telling a story is important to think about, and does it serve the purpose.
Yeah.
And I think that's my goal, is to say, and to be sure I'm intentional about the purpose behind things this week.
Yeah, so ours are like very similar. I would like fire is a tool, right? And it is a very dynamic tool. It can shift depending upon the situation and how we use it. Like it's not like a hammer. Hammer is like can be used for maybe one or two things. We can be creative and use it for a couple other things probably, but like generally it's
It's meant to
designed.
hit something down.
Yeah, that's what it's designed for. Whereas fire is dynamic. It can be used for all the things you listed. It might be a bonfire, it might be a cook fire, it might be an oven. And I think about uh, the stories we tell ourselves that often go unchecked, like the fires that start, so to speak, in our head that, when left unchecked, could turn into a Korra situation where we're just honing in on one thing and it's starting to burn us. And I'm thinking about how all of these fires are starting and these ideas are like lighting in my head, and these are stories that like need to be kept in check and be I need to be aware of them, right? Because fire burns if left unchecked, or it goes out, but if it continues to get fuel. And so the stories that I'm telling myself are, how can I interrupt these stories that I'm telling myself? And how can I be like, okay, that's a fire I want to keep burning because I haven't quite figured out what's going on with it yet. And then there's another fire that I'm like, nope, we're going to pour that out right now. Or I need someone else to give me feedback on whether this fire is useful. And so I think it's just cultivating some awareness around the fact that these things are happening in my head and being like, okay, this is a story, and fact checking whether it's a story I want to keep around or not. So I think it's giving myself permission to stop and think about how I reacted and why I reacted a certain way to something this week. And so when I react, I'm like, oh, let's pause and think about why I'm reacting this way and see if that's something that I want to continue and fuel.
Love that. Self-awareness. It's hard.
It's so hard.
It's hard. All right. Who are we grateful for as we're creating awareness? Something that can be beneficial is gratitude. And so who are we grateful for? Who are you grateful for this episode, Ben?
Yeah, I wrote down a few people because there was a lot going on. So I won't say Asami since you claimed Asami already, but
Gibbs.
I guess I will mention both and lean into one. I think the other people are Tenzin that I'm really grateful for, and Mako. And the reason I'm going to choose Mako in this is because like we were intentionally given a lot of screen time with his story. And I think that we did a really good job, I think, over the course of the series, leaning into his perspective. And I think we also did a poor job. And so there are ways we did well, and there are ways we kind of assumed poor things about Mako.
Mm-hmm.
And I just am kind of really grateful that we got this opportunity to remind ourselves of the importance of perspective. And so I think that's why I'm going to choose Mako.
What a great reminder to have.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think for me, again, Asami, I think the ability to have people in our lives that help kind of shine light on, no, here are the reasons you're enough.
Yep.
I don't know if we have enough of those people. And so when we do have them, showing gratitude for them, I think, is important.
Just
Because
keep it in our corner.
yeah, it's just, I mean, how often, majority of the time, we're thinking about the mistakes that we've made. Very rarely do we pat ourselves on our back, because we think that it's like either cocky or, annoying, or, that makes us annoying people to be around. And sometimes, no, pat yourself on your back. You did some good stuff, y'all. But the ability to have someone say, like, no, you've made an impact that's positive, hearing those types of things, I think, is just super undervalued. And so, one, everyone else out there, a great feedback model is 90% positive to 10% constructive. And so, like,
love Michael Brandwine.
If you're doing that, your relationships are genuinely going to be stronger. So, but we typically don't do those things. And so, again, I'm very grateful for the people that we do 90% coaching and 10%, yay, pizza party for you. And then, so again, when you have those people, I think it's important to be show gratitude towards them. So, Asami,
let's do all of that all the time.
Yep, all of that all the time. Everything, everywhere, all at once. All right, we've got I believe, a special guest next week joining us.
Sure do.
And so that'll be fun. So make sure you come on back for that episode. But as of right now, hit us up on all the socials, BNB_pod. That's Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. That is also where you can find our Patreon that has some bonus things. So if you would like to support us that way, you can join us in live episodes. Ben is currently writing kind of more in-depth analysis, slowly but picking them back up, or will be writing them in the future.
After this week, I'll be picking them back
up. He's
up.
wrapping up some exams and some things to do. So, but yeah, check us out on all the interweb things. Some fun ways to support us through that. But other than that, Ben, you got anything you want to add?
Not at this time.
Great, thank you. I'm Sunshine.
And I'm Ben.
And this has been Bending Not Breaking. Thank you for listening.